Hello guys and welcome back. So in this new Jetpack Compose project series, we are going to create an audio media player from scratch using Media Browser Service Compact APIs. So this is what we are going to build here. As you can see here, we are going to have a list of audio which are going to arise from our device. So we can easily just select anything which we want here and it's going to play up. And it's going to automatically play to the next item here without changing it. And also we can just easily pause here. We can control this. We can skip to the next item here and play. And we can use this seek bar here, for example, to rewind this, or we can just forward this to a certain position. And also we can collapse this. And also here we have the notification manager, which is going to help us to control the playback. So we can just pause here. We can just click, and also we can just go to the next item. And even if we go outside our application, as you can see here, we can just easily check this and we can just use them. We can pause here and we can click this to go back to our media player item here. So guys, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, now before we start here, you have just to get the initial project from the GitHub repository, which I have just linked down in the description box below. So I have added several things here. For example, I have added these colors here, and also inside here, the theme, I have changed this to take up this style here. And also you can just come here to the build.gradle file, and you can see I have added several things here. So go and get this and you are just good to go. Okay, now let's speak about the architecture of our application and how we can just implement this audio player. Okay, so this is going to be our architecture of our application. And as you can see here, the two endpoints, we have the UI and the player. So we have things which are going to help us to manage the player and also to sync with the UI. And in order to do this, we have to implement two things, the media controller and the media session. So the media session here contains the information about the playback state and other things. So for example, the metadata and other things about our playback. And also the media controller is going to help us to control, for example, the player, if we want to play it or pause or do anything else. And for this case here, we have to issue controller calls. And this one is just going to go directly from the UI to the media controller. And the media controller is going to talk to the media session and not directly to the player. And we're going to see why this is going to be important. And also we have the session callbacks, which are going to be implemented by the media controller, which is going to help to control the playback state. And after that, this media session is going to tell the player, for example, to play or pause an audio. And for that case, it's going to return the data to the controller callbacks by telling it, for example, if the state has changed by using the media session keys. And after that, then we are just going to update the UI. And for this case here, we are going to stay in sync with the player state. And as you can see here, also we can easily implement another controller from another application. So for example, the system UI is going to issue controls, for example, to pause the player or to play another music or another audio. And for this case here, we have not implemented this UI, but the system UI offers this UI, which is going to help to control this. And it's going to directly talk to the media session and not the UI. And for this case here, we are just going to stay in sync. So for example, if the system is going to control this, so a user is going to control outside of our application, also this state can easily be updated inside our UI here. And also we could have here another thing, which is going to be the notification manager, for example, and the notification manager is going to talk directly to this media session here, and also it can control the player. And this one is going to be directly reflected here to our UI. And this architecture is just recommended to implement inside audio player applications. So now let's see how we can implement this architecture inside our application. Okay, now let's start here by creating a new package inside here, our audio player. We can just come here and create our package, and we can just call this data. And inside here now we can create another package, and then we're just going to call this model. And inside here now we can create our model class, which is going to represent our audio. And now inside here we can just create our data. So we have here, for example, we want to get the URI. Okay, so these are just all of the information which we want to play our audio. So now here, let's implement a source which is going to help us to get this audio data. And you can have here a source for example, you're just fetching them from an API or from your server. So for our case here, we are just going to get them from using the content resolver to get the data. So we're just going to get this data locally where it's going to be arising from the user data. And for this case, let's create here a new Kotlin class or file. And this one, we are just going to call this content resolver. So this one is going to help us get the data by using the content resolver. And we can just inject this. And here now we can just get the application context. Okay, so basically here we're just getting this context from the DAGGER HILT. So it's going to automatically inject this context, which we are going to use it. So if you don't know what is a content resolver, so a content resolver is an application component inside Android, which is going to help us to talk to another database which we do not own. So for example, if we have a contact database which is arising from the user phone and not inside our application, when we want to query that information, we have to use the content resolver in order to talk to the content provider which is provided by the contract application and then give us that information. So this one is just like a generic SQL statements which we're just going to write here in order to get this data. Now for our case, we're just writing this to get the music data which is just stored inside these other databases which we do not own. Okay, now let's create here variables which are going to help us to get the data. So for our case here, we're just going to define here the cursor. So we have the mCursor. So the cursor is just the data which is going to be returned when we query this database. And this just represents something in a tabular format with the rows and columns. So we can just easily access these rows and individual columns. And for that case here, now let's create things which we want to select. And for this case, we can just provide here a projection. And here we have the media store containing all of the information. So we can just use this media store and we can call here our audio. And basically here now we can get the audio columns and we can select anything which we want. So for our case here, we're just going to get if this one is going to be the display name. And for that case also, we can just use the media store. So these are just the information which we're going to select. So these are all of the columns which we want to select here. And for that case, now we can just easily get our data. Now let's create here a little room. And for that case, now we have to provide a selection clause. So if we want to filter our database, so we can just filter by using this selection clause. And inside here now we can use the media store. So we want to filter this by using the audios. And we can check if this one is going to be is music. Now here we want to check with something. So we are just going to pass in here a question mark. So this is just a recommended way of passing here selection clause. So instead of just passing here a data. So for example, if we allow the user to search. So for example, we want to filter this database by using this search term here. When you provide this search term directly here to the user, they can insert, for example, a SQL statement like drop table, which is going to drop the table. So this one is going to help you to prevent those SQL injection attacks. And for our case here, now we can just pass in here the selection argument. So we can just call here. And here we want to pass in here that thing which is going to be replaced by this question mark here. And for our case, we can just pass in here one, which is going to filter if this one is going to be music. And for that case, now we can just sort here our data. And we can just sort this to be ascending. So we want to ascend our data. Okay, now let's define here functions which are going to help us to get the data. And for our case here, now we can just create a function. And this one is going to return a list of audio. And we can denote this to be coming to the worker thread so that it can be executed inside the worker thread, because this one is just an SQL statement, so it can take a lot of time to execute it. And now here we can just create a private function that is going to help us to fetch this data. Okay, now here we want to return this data, so we can just create here an audio list. So here we have our audio list. Now we can try to initialize here our cursor. So we can just get this cursor and we can use the context in order to query the database. And here we just get the access to the content resolver. And this content resolver here, now we can easily query the database. And here basically now we can pass in the URI. So for our case here, we can just use the media store and we can just call the audio. And we can use this external content URI in order to get this data. And for this case here, now we can just pass in the projection, and which is just the columns which we want to select. And here we can pass in the selection clause. So you pass in here a selection clause, and here now we can pass in a selection argument. And for that case here, now we can just pass in here the sort order. So basically here now we have our cursor to get the data. Okay, now we have here our cursor. Now let's get the individual data here from our cursor. So we can just create here lit, and we can just come here and call this mcursor. And now basically here we can just get the index of these columns. So for example, here we can just get the ID column. And we can use this get column index auth row. And here basically we can just pass in to be a not nullable. And for that case here, now we can just pass in here the media store item which we want to select. And for our case here, we can just use this media store.audio audio columns, and we can just select the ID. So basically here now we have our ID column, and here now we can just change this to other columns which we want to select. And for our case here, we have the display name. Okay, so basically here we have our indexed column. So here we are just using this get column index auth row. So if this index is not going to be available, or this item is not going to be available, then it's going just to throw an exception. So for our case, when we have all of this data, now we can just use the cursor here. Okay, so now here we can check if this cursor is going to have the data. So we can just come here and we can just call count, and we just want to see if this cursor is going to be empty. Now for case here, we can just log an error here. And basically here we're just going to get the error that our cursor is just going to be empty. Now else here our cursor has the data, and because here if the cursor is just going to be 0, so there is no data which we have. Now we can just use here a while, so that we can just loop throughout this cursor and get the individual columns and rows. So for our case here, now we can just apply this cursor, let's move next, and this one is just going to move to the next item. Now here we want to get the individual rows, because we are just going to be looping around through all of the items which are going to be available. Now we can just call the display name. And here now we can just call the get string here, and we can pass in here the display name column which we have just obtained above there. And also we can just do to the rest of the items. So here we're just going to get the ID, and here the ID is going to be long, so we can just call get long, and here we can just call the ID. So here we want to get the URI, so we can just call this URI here. And for the case of URI, we are just going to use the content URIs. And here we can just pass in with appended ID. So we want to add the ID to get the individual item here. Now we can just use the media store. And we can pass in here the external content URI, and we can just pass in the ID of each individual item. And for that case here, now we can just add our audio data. And now here we can just pass in here our data, And for this case here, we have all the data, the URI, the display name, and ID and title. And for that case, now we can just come here and return our data. And we can just get here our data and return this. We can just call here get audio data, get cursor data here, and we can just easily return here our data. And here we have just pass in the audio, but we want the audio from our application. And for that case here, we have finished to create our content resolver. So far here, what we have done, we have just used here a cursor in order to get the data. And here we have used the projection to select the columns which we want. And here we have just filtered our data by using this selection clause and selection argument. And here we have sort our data. And here we have just get our data by querying the database by using the content resolver and get the data. And after that, we use this cursor here to get the index. And after that, we get our index, which we just call here. If our cursor is just not going to be null, then we just going to move to get all of this data inside a single item. And here we just get the individual rows. And after that, we just create an audio list, which we are just going to return inside here our get audio data. So far, so good. So we have here our data fetched. Now we have to create a repository that is going to help us to provide this data to other components. And we can just come here inside our data and create a new package here. And we can just call this repository. And for this case here, now we can just create here a new coding class or file. And here we can just call our repository. And for this case here, now we can just inject here to get the content resolver. So basically here, because the content resolver, we have just injected it here by using DAGGER HILT. So DAGGER will know how to create this class here. And that's why we are just going to pass it here and not construct it, worrying about constructing it. And now for that case here, we can just create here a suspend function that is going to call us to get the audio data. And this one is just going to return a list of audio data. And basically here now we can use with context, and here basically we can pass in a dispatcher, which is going to call this inside the IO dispatcher. So here's just going to switch the thread from the main thread to the IO dispatcher. And basically here now we can just call the content resolver. So this one is just going to fetch the data from the IO dispatcher, which is just going to go to another thread. And after that, we just do not worry about the UI thread being overworked. Okay, so now we have our audio data. Now let's focus to the media part. And now inside here, we can just create a new package, and we are just going to call this media. And inside here, our media, we can just create a new package. And this package here is going to contain the constants because we have a lot of constants which we want to use them. So we can just call these constants. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file, and this one is just going to be object, and here we can pass any type of name. So for case, we're just passing here to be K. And for that case here, now we can just pass in here several variables, and for case, we're just going to pass in here a constant val, and here we want to call this playback notification ID. So here we have our notification channel ID. So this one is going to be used by the notification manager. So you can type anything else here which you want. And for our case here, now we want to pass in the notification channel ID. And also we want to pass in here the root media ID, which is going to be used by the media browser. And basically here also you can just pass anything else. So for our case here, now we have our media root ID, and also we can just add here the custom actions constant, which we are just going to create here. So we can just add here the start media playback action. And here we can just refresh. And here we want to the update playback update information. So we can just pass in here the interval. Okay, so basically here we have this constant which we are going to use them when we create our service. So don't worry about where are we going to use them for now. We are just going to use them inside our service. So for that case here we have our constants. Now let's create here another package, and this one is going to be the package of the service. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file, and here we are just going to create a class, and we are just going to call this media player service. So this media player service is just going to inherit from the media browser service compact. And this media browser service compact requires us to implement two methods, the onGetRoot and the onLoadChildren. So this class is the entry point for browsing and playback commands from the app's UI. And we can allow even other apps that wishes to play music via our app. So for example, an Android Auto or the Google Assistant to control our playback. So the browsing begins with the method music on get root, and it continues to the music.onloadChildren callback. So we have here two methods, this one on get root, which is going to link up with the activity. So our service is just going to be like a server client setup. So we have here our media player service, which is going to be a server, and this one is just going to start from the on get root, and here we are just going to return the root. And basically here now we can just use the constant which we have created, which is just the media root ID, and here we can just pass in null. So inside this browse root here we can just check up if this user is going to be, for example, allowed to browse our root. So here, this method here, we can just perform to check the user. But for our case, we're just returning anyone can easily access this. So if you want, for example, to limit a type of user, or if the user is not, for example, registered or anything else, then you can just restrict them here to not browse the root. However, this method here is required to return really fast. So any other logic must be implemented inside this onload children here, and we are just going to see how we can just load these children here. Now for our case here, we can just come here to the manifest file in order to add this Android media player service here to be recognized. Now we can just come here below our activity here, and we can just declare here our service, and here we have our media browser service, and we can just easily add here our service tag here. And basically here we want to pass in Android export, so we can just pass in is exported, this one to be false. And also we have to declare here an intent filter. So you must pass in here the name, which is just not going to be showing up in autocomplete. So we have this Android media browser.media browser service. So you have just to implement this intent filter here in order for the media browser service to work. Now for this case here, we have just finished to register here inside our media player service. So in the next videos, we're just going to speak in detail on this method here on media player service. Now we have just to link up so for now here we have to link up the DAGGER HILT here in order to make it to function correctly. So we can just add here at Android entry point in order to mark this to be an entry point, because we are just going to use these functions which we are going to be injecting. And also we can just come here to our main activity, and also we can just add here at Android entry point. Now here what we have to do, we can just come here and add our application function. So we can just call here our audio application, and this one is just going to inherit from the application class. And with DAGGER HILT here, we can just annotate this with HILT Android app, and this one is just going to bring those code generations. So for our case here, we can just collapse this, and for now let's try here to build the application and see if we don't have any errors. So our application has built successfully, so we are just good to go. Now let's create here a new package which is just going to be for our dependency injection. So we can just create here our package, and we can just call this DI. And for that case here, we can just create here a new coding class or file, and we can just call this service module. Okay, now we can add here several annotation to tell DAGGER HILT that this class is going to be a module. So a module class is a class in which we can add the binding for a class that we cannot construct or inject. So here we can provide several classes and we can just bind them when we cannot construct or inject. So for example, here a content resolver, we created this class and we can easily construct and inject it here. So we do not need to provide here a binding inside this service module. So a class which we do not own, for example, or a third party class, so we can just try to provide it here, it's binding inside this at module. And when you annotate a class with at module, so Dagger will just create this class inside a container. And also here we have to add another annotation here, which is just called at install in. And here we can just call this service component. So at install in indicates in which HILT container the binding must be available in. So it's just going to be scoped in that class. So for our case, we want this to be available for a service. So we have just added this at install in service component. So they are just going to be added inside that container. And now here we can just try to provide here several variables which we want. Okay, so for our case here, we're just going to use ExoPlayer to play our media. And we want to configure this ExoPlayer to be used inside our service. So we can just tell things which we want to use them. So the first thing here, we want to provide the audio attributes to tell what type of media type we want to play. So for our case here, we can just create here a new function and we can call this provide audio attributes. And this one is just going to return audio attributes. And you have to select this com.google.exoplayer. And here basically now we want to return our audio attributes. We can use audio attributes builder. And here basically we can set the content type. And here we want to set, for our case, we are just going to use music as our content type. And also we can just set the usage. And here we want to set c.usage media. And we can just import this constant here. And basically we can just finish by building here our audio attributes. Now we want to tell Dagger where are these components being created for, and here we can just call at provide. And this at provide tells Dagger that this class we do not own and we cannot construct or inject. So you have just to create it here when we want to create an instance of this class. And for that case, now we can just scope this. Only we get a single component. So we can just call this service component, service scoped. So basically this one is just going to be scoped from the service. So we just get the same instance when we are just using it in our service. So we don't get multiple instances of this same audio attributes. Okay, now let's create here a little room and we can create here our function. And we want now to provide the ExoPlayer. So we can just call here provide ExoPlayer. Now here we can just pass in the application context. And also we can just provide here the audio attributes. And because we have just created here our audio attributes, so Dagger now knows how to create these audio attributes. And this one is just going to return the ExoPlayer. Now we can use here the ExoPlayer interface here to create and use a builder button to create this. And basically here we can just pass in the context and we can just call .build here. And basically here we can just pass in also to be and to be through the audio focus. And this one is just going to be automatically set up for us. So for example, if a user is going to remove the headphone, so the audio is going to be paused automatically. So this one, when we use ExoPlayer, we get these things automatically, and also handling audio focus is going to be handled automatically. So for example, if there is a notification entering and our audio is playing, so here it can just easily handle the audio focuses for our case. So now we have provided here the ExoPlayer. So another thing which we want to provide here is the data source factory. So the data source factory is going to help us to read the data from different sources. Now we can just create here a function and we can call this provide. And also this one is just going to require here to pass in the application context. We can use this the default data source and we can just call the factory here and easily pass in the context. So the data source factory helps in creating connection to read data from different sources, and we can implement a custom one if the source is not supported. So for our case, we are fetching data locally, we can easily use the default one, which suffice our need of caching the data. So for example, if you are fetching the data from the internet, you can just use the HTTP data source, and this one is just going to provide the caching mechanism that is going to help us to cache the data. And also here we can just copy this here. And also what we want to do here, we want to cache our data. Okay, now let's create here our provide function for the cache data. And here we can just pass in again the application context. And also we want to pass in here the data source. And basically this one is just going to return the cache data source factory. And here now we have to get the cache directory. So we can just create here a cache. And basically here now we can just call this media. And after that, now we have to get the database provider. So we can just call here database provider. And we can use the standalone database provider. And basically here now we can just pass in here the context. And for that case, now we can just create our cache. So this here no OP cache evictor, meaning that when, for example, we want to limit our cache to grow in a size, so you can just use, for example, here there is another cache evictor, which is just called list recently used cache evictor, and here you can just pass, for example, you want to get the amount, so max bytes. So if you pass in here 1000, so when the cache reaches this 1000, the list used item is going to be removed inside this cache. So for our case, we're just passing here no cache evictor, and for that case now we can just create and return here our cache. And basically now we can just set the cache. And here we can just use the data source which we have created here. And basically, so if anything which is not going to be inside this cache here, then it's going to use this upstream data media here to fetch the data source. And for our case, that is just the content resolver. So when the method is not here, then it's just going to get this using this data source factory here. And also here we can annotate this with @provide. So here we provide a cache that can be used to get the data required for our EXO player. So the cache will be fulfilling the request which we have from our EXO player. And if not, this request will be fulfilled from the upstream sources. And for this case here is what we are just going to provide here, a default data source factory, which is going to fetch from the content resolver here to get our data. Okay, so now we have finished to create here our module, and as you can see here, we have used to provide this audio attribute, which is going to be used as a dependency inside here provide exo player, and we have provided here our exo player, and also we have provided this data source, which is just a dependency in order to create here a data source factory. And for that case here, we have created our cache data source factory. Now let's come here to our media player service here and inject these variables. So the first variable which we want here, we can just call @inject, and we can create here a let init variable, and we can just call this data source factory. And for that case also we can just inject here our exo player. So basically here now we have injected here our variables. Now let's try here to build the application and see if the output is going to be okay. Okay, so when we build here, we're just getting this error here. We cannot have more than one binding method with the same name. So when we come here to our service module, you can see that we are just passing here the same name from this provide data source factory, and this one is just required to be a cache data source factory. Now let's try to rebuild again and see. Okay, now we can just come here to our media package here and create a new package, and we can just call this exo player. And inside this exo player here, we can just create a new coding class or file. And this one, we are just going to call it media source. So now we can just inject this, and we can pass in here a repository. Okay, so now here what we want to do, we want to allow the client or the use of this class, which is going to be our media player service compact. So we can just create a link or a token between this, and the good way is just creating callbacks. And for our case here, we can just come here and create a type alias class. And this one we're just going to call it already listener. And this one is just going to be of type Boolean, returning a unit. So type alias in Kotlin means a way to give an existing type a new name. So it provides an alternative naming to your existing type to reflect a more readable code. So we are just going to use this lambda function here to communicate to our media player service compact here. And in order to do that, we have to create this function here. So we can just add this type alias here to give the name to this Boolean function, so that when we just pass this already listener, we can just understand that we are just going to use this already listener. And for that case here, now we can just come and create our variable, which is going to keep up the listeners. And here basically now we have created a mutable list of unread listeners, which we're just going to receive from our media player service. Okay, so now we want to create a state that is going to help us to decide when our media data are going to be fully loaded or if they are not loaded. So we can just come below this class here and create an enum class. And here we have several states. So for example, here we're just going to have a state created. So basically here we're just going to see if the state is going to be created, and here is when the state has not fully loaded our media data, and here it is now loading the data, and here also it's just already finished to load the data, and here we have an error. So for that case we can just change this state whenever we want. Okay, now here we want to create our state. Let's create first a little room here. Okay, so here we want to create a state variable, so we can just create here a private var. And this one is just going to be of audio state. And for our initial state here is just going to be audio state created. And we're just creating this variable here because these already listeners are going to be executed inside our media player service. And at most it's just going to be executed on the when we're just returning the child to the client. So for example, when we are sending data back to the activity, so from the service to the activity, so we are just going to use these already listeners to send the data. And also we're just when we are preparing the media for playback, so we're just going to use these already listeners in order to execute this data. And for that case, we must be in a state that we have already initialized the sources, so we can just disallow to send these media sources or media data when we have not fully loaded. And this is just the purpose of this state here. And now we want to check this state here. We can pass in here a set value, and inside here now we can just check if, for example, our value which we are just coming here to set is going to be the audio source state created. So we can just pass it here. Or if we are just getting an error here, we are passing an error value. Okay, so now here we want to initialize our variables, and here this already listener is going to be executed in a background thread. So for example, when we are just preparing the media ID or when we are just returning the data to the client, and for this case, this is going to be executed in multiple threads. So in order to keep the state in sync, we have to use a concept which is called the synchronization. So we can just call here synchronized, and here basically we can just unlock these already listeners so that we can easily modify the state inside a single thread. So we can just pass in here the field, and we can just initialize this to a value which we are just going to pass here. So if you don't know about synchronization, so synchronization helps in keeping the state the same state across the threads. So when we have multiple threads, then we can just keep the same state across threads. So you can picture this as a bathroom that one person enters and then locks that bathroom. So for our case here, it's just the already listeners is going to lock the bathroom. Then here inside this curly braces here where we have our block, then we are just going to poop, or we can just execute here our things which we are just going to do. Then after that, when we finish up here, this already listeners is going to open up, so another thread can just enter here again and get the same value. And for that case, we have our value initialized in a single thread and in a thread safe manner. Okay, and now for that case here, we want to pass in here the listeners, and we can use on each of these listeners. And now here we can just change these listeners. So we're just going to loop through all of these commands which have been sent from the media player service so that we can just invoke them here. So we're just going to see how we can use these methods here in our lead listeners. So we can just pass in this listener and we can just invoke here. And here we are required to pass in a boolean. And here we can just create a function. And we can just call this is ready. And then this one is going to return a boolean. And here we can just provide a get function here. And what we want to do, we can just check if this state is going to be in a state initialized. So if we are in a state that we have already initialized, so we can just pass in here is ready. And for this case here, we have just changed the value, and also we have passed to these listeners that this media source is just ready. You can try to use them. And otherwise that we have passed in here an else statement. And here basically we can just set the field to the value which is coming. Okay, now here we have finished to set up our state. Now let's create here a function that is going to help us to get these already listeners or these actions here to execute them here. Now we can just create here a little room. And for our case here, we can just create a function and we can call this one ready. And this type here must return a boolean. Okay, now inside here, we can just return and we can just check if this one is just going to be in a certain state. So for our case here, we can just check the state. If this one is just going to be to the audio source state created. Okay, so basically here we are checking if our state is going to be either in a state created or in a state initializing. So our media source is not ready. And for this case here, we can just pass in here the already listeners which we have so that we can just structure them to be used later. And what we have to do here, we can just add this data and we can just pass in here the listener. And otherwise here we can just pass in false because we have not finished to load our data. And else here now we can just check this, we have already fully loaded, so we can just pass in here the listeners and we can just invoke this function and we can just check if this one is going to be ready. And for that case also we can just pass in here to be true. Okay, so we have created here when ready. This function here is going to be accessed here from our media player service. So we are just going to pass in here the listeners or the things or actions which we want to execute them here. And first case, we are just going to check if our state is either created or initializing. And for this case here, our media is not fully loaded. So what we have to do, we have to queue these listeners in order to come to execute them when we have finished to load them. And we have to tell the client that this is not fully loaded by passing in here false. Otherwise that our state is loaded and our media source are ready. Now we can just call this listener here and invoke and pass in to check if this is just been either loaded or not. So it could be in a state of an error. So we can just tell this it's just going to be in an error state here by invoking it and not just queuing it inside here listeners. Okay, so this can be a little bit confusing, but take your time. If you have not understood this, you can just really watch again this part. As you can see here, we are just creating these ready listeners here in order to queue the actions from the media browser service so that we can just execute them when our state is ready. And here, basically, we are just creating our state. And the first instance here, our state is going to be created because we are just not going to be having the data loaded. And for this case here, now we are just going to check when we want to set in this value, and then we are just going to see it in a moment when we are going to load the values. So we're just going to set this value here. If this one is just going to be either in this two state here, either created or error, then we can just come here to use this synchronization here. And this synchronization is going to help us to keep the state across multiple threads so that we can just execute this on ready listeners and change the state here only once, so not on multiple threads. And for that case here, we can just loop around all of those ready listeners, and we can just check if this one is going to be ready. And we defined here a function that if this one is going to be ready, as you can see here, we are just going to check the state. If this state is going to be equal to state initialized, and for that case, we can just return this and invoke the functions which we have been queuing them. Otherwise, that our state is neither in these two states here, so we can just set the values to the state to this value which we are going to set here. Now let's implement a method that is going to help us to load the media source from the repository. Okay, now let's create here a suspend function. So this function here is going to be called load and help us to load the data. And basically here now we can just get our data and we can just call the repository. Now what we want to do here, we want to transform this data because here we have our audio data. So this audio data is not recognized by the media player service and the EXO player. So we want to transform this to a metadata that can be easily recognized. So we can just come here and create a function, a variable. Now here we can just create a variable. So we can just call this audio media metadata. And this one is just going to be of list. And then we just want to pass in here the media metadata compact. And basically now we can just initialize this first time to be an empty list. And for that case, we can just come here to get our audio metadata. So we can just reinitialize this. And then we can just get this data, and we want to map this data to what this audio metadata understands here. And here basically we can just use the media metadata compact. And for this case here, we want to put the string. Okay, we can just rename this to audio. So here basically now we want to use the metadata in order to transform these functions. So we can just use this media metadata. And for example, here we can just keep in here the ID. And basically now we can just pass in here the ID. Okay, so basically here we can just do this to the rest of the item which we have. And here basically now we can just change this from here, but we can put the album artist. And here basically now we can just put the long. Okay, so basically here now we have just get our data, and then we have transformed this to the media metadata compact, which is just understood by our media player. Okay, now here we can just reinitialize our state here. So for example, here we are just going to be in a state of initializing. So we can just use this audio state, and here we are initializing our state. And after we just transform this data here, now we can just tell that our data is ready to use. So we can just put in here the state initialized. So as you have seen here, now we have changed the state here. So we can just inform that this one has already been initialized, and then we can just call this on ready listeners here for our case because the data has already been fully loaded here. Okay, so we have made here our data fetched, so it is fully loaded. And what we want to do here is to provide the function that is going to transform these media metadata items being playable by the player. And for our case here, our player is EXO player, so we can just create here a little room, and here we can just create a new function, and this function is going to be called as media source. And this one function is going to take up a data source factory. And this function here is going to return a concatenating media source. Now here we can create here a concatenating media source. So basically we want to play our item when first item finishes to play the next item, and this is just like similar to a playlist structure. So for that case, we're just using this concatenating media source for that case. And here now we can just get our audio data, and we can just loop around to get every item here. Okay, now what we want to do here is to get the media item, because this concatenating data source requires us to pass in here the media item. And for this case here, we can just call the media item, and we can easily create here a media item. So we can just come here and create a media item, and you have to select this com.google.android exo player. And basically here now we can call from URI. And because here we have a URI, we can just call here a media, we can just call here our media metadata. and we can just get a string here. So basically here now we have just passed in here our URI, which we want to get it. Also, we want to create here a media source. So we can just create here a variable and we can just call this media source. And here we want to make a progressive media source that is going to help us to get the data. So we can just call this progressive media source. And basically here now we are just going to pass in here the factory. And for our case here, we can just pass that data source factory, which we have passed there. And then we can just set here the media source. So here we are just going to add the media sources and we can just call here our concatenating media source. And we can just add here our media source. And for that case here now we can just return here our media source. Okay, so basically here we have just creating here a concatenating media source, and inside this our audio metadata we have fetched the media item, which is just recognized in ExoPlayer in order to play a media item. And here what we have done, we have added here progressive media source that is going to use the data source factory here to fetch the data. And also we have created this media source by using this media item here. And for that case, we have added this inside our concatenating media source and return this data, which is going to be used by the ExoPlayer in order to play those multiple items which we have added inside here. Okay, now here our media player has a data source that it can easily play. So what we want to create here is another function that is going to give us the media data, which is going to be returned by the media browser service. So when we are sending data back to the client, we have to send the media item which is suitable for display. And this one is just suitable for playing, and we want to create a media item that is suitable for displaying. So we can just create here another function and we can just call this. And basically here now we can just use this audio metadata and we can just map it. So we can just create here a function which is called description. So we are just going to use here media description compact, and this one is just Android support.vision4.media. And basically here now we can just call the builder. Okay, what we want to do here, we want to set the title. We can just transform this to be metadata. And here basically we can just pass in here the media ID. Also we can pass in here the media URI. So basically these are the data which are going to be used when we want to display our item. So you can just use this media browser compact here, and we can just create here a media item, and easily here now we can just pass in here the description, and we can just pass in here a flag which is going to be flag playable, and we can just put this, and we can just put in here the media browser compact here version 4. And for this case here now we can just transform this to mutable list. And for that case here we have our media item, which is going to be used by our media browser service to send the data back to the client when it wants to display. And here basically now we can just create a function that is going to help us to refresh. Now we can just use these already listeners here and we can just clear them. And for this case, we can just pass in here our state back to be audio. Okay, so finally here our media source is complete. So don't get confused here. We are just using here a media item. This one is just going to be used by the media browser service to return the data to the client, and this one is just going to be used suitable for display. And here this one is just suitable for playing, and this one is just going to be used by ExoPlayer. So you are just going to see this in action when we try to implement this inside our media player service. Okay, now here we can just inject our variable. And we can create here another letInit variable. And for this case, we are just going to call our media source. And for that case, let's try to rebuild here and see if we don't have any error. So guys, our project has finished up to build successfully. So now let's see here how we can implement this. Okay, now we want to create a coroutine scope that is going to be tied with this service. So when this service is going to be destroyed, then the coroutine scope also is going to be destroyed, so we don't have memory leaks. And for this case here, now we can just create a job that is going to be from this service job. So we can just create a private val and we can just call this service job. And here we can just create a supervisor job. And after that, now we can just create here our scope. And now we can just create here our coroutine scope. And here we can just add here our service job. And basically we are just going to cancel this service job when we are going to finish up our service. And for that case, now we want to create our media session, which is going to help us to connect the media player. So here we're just going to create a media session compact. So media sessions provide a universal way of interacting with an audio or video player. So it's going to inform Android that media is playing in an app. So we can use this media session to control playback from different places, like a physical button from a remote or Google Assistant. And for that case here, a newly created media session has no any capabilities. So we have to connect it to the player. And in order to do this, we have to create a connector. And luckily here, our Exo player has a connector which is already implemented. So we can just pass in the instance of this class to connect between the media session and the media controller. Otherwise, if we could be using another media player, for example, the normal Android media player, we could have to create this media session connector. So for that case, we can just create here another private rate init variable, and we can just call this media session connector. And now here we have our media session connector. Okay, so also we want to allow the user to control the music playback in the notification. So in order to do this, we have to create a notification manager. So we can just come here inside our media class, inside our Exo player, and we can just create here a new coding class or file. And this one we are just going to call it media player. So we're just going to call it media player notification manager. Okay, and we can just make this to be an internal class. And basically here now we can just pass in several dependencies which this class requires. So for our case here, we can just pass in the context. And also here we can just pass in the session tokens. And here we can just use the media session compact.token. And also here we want to get the notification listener. And we can just use this player notification listener. And we can just create here a variable that is going to help us to manage this notification. So we can just call this notification manager. And basically here we can just pass in the notification player manager. So we're just going to initialize this in a moment. So we can just come here inside an init block. And now here we have to get the media controller that is going to help us to control the media sessions using the notification. So we can just create here a media controller. And here basically we can just pass in the context and the session token. And for that case here now we can just create a builder that is going to help us to build the notification. Okay, and basically here now we can just pass in the context, and then we can just use here the constants, and we can just pass in here the notification ID, and make sure this notification ID is going to be an int. And also here we can just pass in the playback notification channel ID. So these are just the constants which we created in previous videos, which for now we are just going to use them. And for that case here now we can just use this builder here to set up our channel. So we want to set here the description adapter, which is going to help us to set the description or the content of the media. So we can just set here media description adapter, and we're just going to create an instance of description adapter right now here. So let's just set up here the notification listener, and for our case here we can just pass in our notification listener, which we have passed there. And also here we can just set the channel resource ID, and here basically you have to pass in, for example here we're just going to pass in a string. So you can just pass n type of a screen here. So we can just pass in here the notification channel, and also we can just set here the notification. We can set here the channel notification resource ID, and here we can just use ara.string.descriptions. So basically here now we have set everything. Now we want to create here a description adapter, which is going to help us to set the titles and other things, or to provide the metadata to the notification manager. So here we can just pass in the controller. So we can just call here controller. So this class here is going to inherit from the player notification description adapter. So you can just come here to this media description adapter, and here we have several classes which we have to implement. So we can just implement all of these methods here. Okay, so here we have to set the content. So we can just use the player here, the controller. So we can just use this controller, and we can just come here to get the description. And basically here now we can just pass in the title, and we can just transform this to a string. And also here we just want to provide an intent. So this intent here is going to be launched when the user clicks the notification. So we can just make here the controller, and we can just pass in here the session activity. So for our case here, this session activity is just going to be our main activity. So when a user is just going to click this notification, then it's just going to be directed toward our player activity. And for that case here also we can just provide the subtitle here, and we can pass in here the subtitle. So if you have an icon which you want to pass here, so for our case we are just going to return null here. So if you have an icon which you want to pass to this notification, so you can just get this large icon. So for our case we are just passing null here. Okay, now here we can just come here and set our description adapter. And basically here now we can just pass in here our media controller. So this description adapter here help us to pass in the metadata to this notification manager. So for that case here we have set up our builder. So we can just create here more room, and we want to initialize our notification manager now. And we can just use this builder, and we can easily just build here. And also here we can just use this with notification manager. Okay, so here we can just set the media session token, and basically here now we can just pass the session token. And also here we want to set the small icon. So here I have no any icon which I have created, so you can just come here to resource manager and come to this vector asset here, and easily we can just create here a music node. So you can just pass in here this icon, small icon. You can just use ara.drawable, and we can just use this icon baseline music node. So you can provide here, for example, the logo of your application or any other icon. So for case we're just going to use that music node, and then you can try here to set use rewind action. So for case we can just pass in here false and set forward action. And also here we can just set this to false. We can just come below here to allow when the user is going to show or hide the notification. So we can just create here a function that is going to be hiding the notification. And here we have to pass in a player, and we can just call this notification manager set player, and we can easily pass in here our player. Okay, now let's come here to our media player service, and for our case here we can just create another private let init variable, and basically here we can just set our notification manager, and also we can just set another variables which we are just going to use them. So for our case here we can just check the current media, the current playing item, and also here we can just check if our, and basically we can just set this to false, and also here we want to check if this one is going to be is foreground. Okay, so here we have our media player notification manager. Also we can just get the current playing media item, so we are just going to use it in a moment. And also here we are going to check if the player is initialized or not, and also we can just check is the foreground service. So this our service could not be a foreground service, so we are just going to see it in a moment. Okay, now here we're just going to create a companion object, which is just going to help us to provide here some constants which are going to be related to this class. So we can just create a private const val, and here we're just going to call this tag. And also here we want to create another variable, and this one we are just going to call it current duration. So this current duration here is going to come in handy when we create our UI. So you're just going to see this in a moment. And now here when we receive the onCreate command, we have to perform necessary initialization to set up our media browser. So we can just override here the onCreate. Okay, so here we want to create a session activity pending intent that is going to help us to launch the UI. So we are just going to call this session activity intent. And we can just use the package manager here to get the intent here, and we can just call get launch intent for, and here we can just pass in the package name. So here we have our session intent. So we can just create here a new pending intent. We can pass here this for the context and request code to be 0. And also here we can just pass in here the session intent. And for that case here now we can just create we can pass in here flags. So we can just call this pending intent. Okay, so here we have our session intent here. So what we want to create also here, we want to initialize the media session. So we can just create here the media session, and we can use the media session compact here to create a new media session. And for here we can just pass the context to be this, and also we can just pass in here our tag. And also here now we can just set the session activity, and here basically now we can just pass in here the session activity intent. And for that case here also we can just set is active to be true. So here we have our media session, but we have to connect this to the media browser. And for this case here, we have to set the session in the session token. So we can just call this session token, which is the session token for this media browser. So the media browser is going to connect to this media session which we have created here. And for that case here, now we can just call this media session, and we can pass in here the token. Okay, now also let's initialize here our media player notification manager. So we can just call here a new media player notification manager. And basically here now we have to pass in here the context, and we're just going to use the context of this activity. And also we can just pass in here the media session.session token, so that we have our session token. Also we have to create here a notification listener. So we can just come here below our onload children here and create another inner class. Okay, so this class is going to inherit from the player notification manager, and we can select this notification listener here. And here there are just two methods which we want to override: the on notification cancel and the on notification posted. So inside here, our on notification cancelled, we want to stop the service if the notification is cancelled. So we don't want to continue to run our audio player if the notification has been dismissed by the user. So for this case here, we can just call stop foreground, and we want to remove also the notification, and we can just basically pass through here, and we can check if this is foreground. And here basically we can just pass back to false because our notification was cancelled, and we don't want to continue to play the audio, so we can just call stop self, and for that case we have finished to stop. And here now we come to our notification posted, and what we want to do here, we want to check if this is just going to be ongoing. Basically now here we want to start our foreground service because we are not in a foreground. So we can just use this context compact, and we can just call start foreground service. And here basically we can just pass in the application context, and we can start a new intent here. And basically also here we can pass the application context, and we want to pass the media activity, and we can just call this .java class. So basically here now we are going to start our foreground service, and for this case here we want to also call start foreground, and here basically now we want to post our notification. So we can just pass in here the notification ID, and we can easily pass in the notification itself. And basically here now we can pass in is foreground service here, and we can just make this to be true. And here basically we just set this player notification here. So after that also we want to load our data, so we can just use the service scope which we have created. So we can just call this service scope.launch, and basically here now we can use our media source, and here what we want to do, we want to load our data. And now also we want to initialize our media session connector, so we can just call here media session connector, and we can just create a new media session connector. And this one requires us to pass in here the media session, and we can call apply here to set some things which we want to override. So we can just set here the playback preparer, which is going to help us to prepare our media for playing. And also here we want to set the queue navigator. So this queue navigator here is going to help us to navigate between different playback items. Okay, now let's create here another inner class that is going to help us to prepare the media. So we can just come below this player notification listener here, and we can create another inner class. So basically here we're just going to inherit from this media session connector.playback preparer, and we can just override these several methods which are going to be provided here. Okay, so basically here we're just going to return false, and these are just places which we can easily customize our playback preparing. And for example, here we're just going to provide the supported actions which we want our application to support. So for our case here, we can just use the playback state compact here and provide this action prepare from media ID. And also we can just add this all in order to provide another playback state which we want to prepare for. So for our case here, we want to provide this action play from media. So here we could prepare from the media ID, or we can play from the media ID. So if, for example, if we pause for the first time, then we can just easily use this here to play back the audio. And here basically we are just going to return unit, and we are just going to use this method here to prepare from the ID. And basically, we are just going to implement that method in a moment. But when you come here, this one on prepare from search, this one can be used by, for example, the Google Assistant in order to play back the audio. So for our case here, we are just going to return unit because this will be an overkill to implement inside this simple application here. If you want to also prepare from a URI, so for our case here, we're just going to return unit. So what we want here is to implement this on prepare from media ID here. Okay, so we can just create a little room here. So the first thing which we want to get here is the item to play. So here we are just going to use the media source and locate the media item which we want to play. So we can just get the audio metadata, and we can just use a Kotlin find function here. Okay, so here also we can just set the current playing media item, which the first time we set it to null, so we can just pass it to the item to play here. And also we want to create a helper function that is going to help us to prepare the media. So we can just come below this and create here a private function. And this function here is going to take us the media metadata. And also this one is just going to take up a list of audio metadata. And also here we can just pass in the item to play. And also this one is supposed to be media metadata compact. So the first thing, we want to get the index from where we are just going to start to play our media. So we can just call this index to play. And basically now we can just check if our current media item is going to be equal to null, we can just return 0. And else here we can just and we can just pass in here the item to play index. So if our current playing media is going to be equal to null, we can just pass in here to be 0, or we can just start from the item to play here to get the index from where our media is going to start. So if the media is not inside, for example, here the item to play is going to be null, and here basically we are just going to start from 0. Or if our current playing media is null, we are just going to start from the first item which we have inside our list. And for that case here, now we want to use the exo player. And we're just going to set this listener in a moment here so that we can easily execute our application. And also we want to set the media source. And here basically now we can just use the media source, and we want to pass in here a data source factory which we have created from our previous videos. So basically here we are just using this media source, and we are converting this by using the media source which we did from the previous videos. And for that case we can just prepare our exo player. We can just call this prepare. And basically here now we can just pass in the index, and we want to start from 0 position. Play when ready. So basically here now we have just passed inside here our media source. We have prepared our media, and here seek2 we want to start from the index which we have here, the item which we have. So for the case here, if this index is going to be null, then we start from 0, and otherwise we are just going to pass in the item index. So if it could be a 5th item, then we are just going to start from the 5th item to play our media. And after that, then we call this play when ready if the item is just ready. So we want to add here a listener which is going to listen to playback events. That is going to help us to manage the event of this exo player. Okay, so inside here we want to override several methods. So the first method here we want to override is on playback state change. Also we can just override on events and on player error. So we're just going to use this method here to get the events from the player so that we can just react to different state changes. So for our case here, we can just pass in here a when statement. So we want to check between this playback state. So we can just pass in this playback state. So we could be in different states here. So for example, we can just use this player.state if we are, for example, buffering, or we are just going to be in a state of state ready. So basically here, if we are just in a state buffering already, that means our player is just ready to play the audio. So we can just show the notification. So we can just call this media notification manager.show notification. And basically here we can just pass in here our exo player. And here else we can just use this media player notification manager, and we can easily stop the notification. So we can just hide this notification. So if we are not in this playback state, either buffering or state ready, we show the notification, and otherwise else we can just easily hide the notification. And we implemented this method from the previous video here. And we have here the on events, and here we want to get the player duration so that we can just set our current duration. And for this case here, we can just call the current duration here, and we can use this player.duration in order to get the duration of the player. And this one here, you can just use the on events in order to get a single event. So for example, here you're just getting event, and also you want access to the player. So you just override this method for those cases where you want the player and you want to obtain, for example, a single event. Otherwise, you can just use this state ready here in order to execute your functions. So this on player is going to be executed on player error when we have any error. So we can just create here a message, and basically you could have any message here. So for example, here I have a message inside our string. So we can just call this a generic error. So if this is just a normal error, unknown error, so you can just pass in here a message, and we want here to log. We want to change this message if this error has been, for example, if not file not found. So we can just check this if the error which we have here, and we can just get the error code, and this one is just going to be equal to playback exception. And here we have our playback error file not found, for example. So if this is the case, so for example, if you could have, you are fetching data from the HTTP request, you can just use the HTTP error code here. And for that case here, now we can just reinitialize this message here and we can just use another message. So for our case here, we can just use this file not found, media not found here. And we can just create a simple toast message here. And for that case here, we have our player event states here. And here basically now we can just pass in our player event listener. And for that case here, we have our media ready. And what we want to do here, we can just come to the place where we have to set the playback preparer. And here basically now we can just pass in the audio playback preparer. And what we want to implement again here is the queue navigator, which is going to help us to navigate between items. Okay, now let's create here a queue navigator. And here now we can just pass in the media session. And this queue navigator here requires us to pass in the media session. So we can just pass in here this media session compact. And for that case here, now we can just implement this one method here, which it requires us to implement here. And here we have access for the player, and also we have access to this window index, which is just going to be the index of the playing media item. So then when we are navigating here, we are just getting this window index. And for this case here, we have to check if we are out of bound, and then we can just limit this. And here basically now we have to check if our window index is going to be less than our media sources item. So we can just get this audio metadata and we can check the size. So if we are just, this must be less than. So if we are just less than this size here, we can just navigate to the next item. Otherwise, we are just going to return an empty. So here we can just return this item, and here we can just use our media source. And we can use here our window index, and we can just call the description and basically return our description. And otherwise here we are just going to return an empty item. So we can just return here a media description. So here we check if the window index is not out of bound and navigate to the next item. And otherwise here we are just going to queue this navigation and return just an empty media description compact. And here basically we can just pass in the queue navigator, and we can just pass in here our media session. Okay, now after we finish to set up this playback preparer and queue navigator, we can just pass in here the player. And for our case here, we are just going to use this exo player, and you can just use another player. So we can just go with this exo player here. And for that case here, now we can just call the media player notification manager here. And we can just easily call here to show notification, and we can just pass in here our exo player. Okay, now I think we have finished to create here our own create method and perform necessary initialization. So we have here two methods. So the first method here is this onGetRoot and the onLoadChildren. And these two methods here helps to provide a client connection. So we have a server, which is just our media browser service here to be a server, and our client is which the main activity. So when we want to send the data back to the main activity, we can just use these two methods here to perform the connection. So the first method here, the onGetRoot, is going to provide, for example, the access to this service here. So for our case here, we are just returning here this media root ID here. So if this user, for example, you don't want to be allowed, so you can just restrict them and not return this media root ID. And for our case here, we can just come to this onLoadChildren here, and we can perform necessary logic in order to see if our user is actually allowed to browse this data. So we can just create here a when function. And here basically now we can just pass in the parent ID, and now we want to check if this parent ID is going to be, and here we have our media root ID, and this is just the same media ID which we passed here. So when we get the parent ID matching this, so we know that this user is actually allowed to browse this data. And for that case, we can just now create our result and send the result back to the client. And here we can just call this result sent. And here basically now we can just call the media source, and we can call this one ready function. And this one ready here we created from the previous video. So when we click here this one ready, you can see that this one ready is going to return here a boolean item. And if you see here, we are just going to see if our media source is or actually initialized. And for this case, if it is not initialized or the data is not loaded, we are just going to return false. And otherwise here we are just going to return true because we have invoked these items, and the listeners are actually which we are going to implement them right now here. So as you can see here, we have the media source and when ready. And for this case here, now we have to return the results. So we can just rename this to is initialized. And basically here now we can just check if this item is initialized, or actually we want to send the results to get the data because here our media is already loaded. And for this case here, we can just call the results and we can call send result. And here basically now we can just use this media source and we can call as media item. So basically here now we are just sending the media item. Otherwise here our media item is or our media source is not loaded, so we are just going to return null here. So we can just send the result and pass in null. And for that case here, our data is not initialized. And we can just check if our result, so we can check this result sent. And we detach if our result is not sent, and because this one ready here is going to return true or false. And here basically now we want to queue this, and this one is just going to detach this message from the current thread and allow the send result to call to happen later. So we are just going to suspend this returning of result until when the media source have been fully loaded. And for that case here, now we can just easily detach this method here. And for that case here, now we have already finished to send our result. And otherwise else here, the user is not allowed to browse our data, and we can just easily return here a unit. Okay, so basically we have said that this onload children is going to send the result back to the client. And for our case here, we are just going to use this parent ID in order to send this result here, which is just the media browser item. If the user is allowed to provide this data or to access this data, then we can just check here this media source if is actually ready, and then we can just check here if this item is initialized, so the media source is already loaded, then we can just send the result with the media item. Otherwise here our media item is not fully loaded, then we are just going to return null. And otherwise if the result is not sent entirely, then we want to suspend this sending of result until later time, so we can just suspend those threads which are going to send the results. And otherwise else if this is not the case, then we return unit here because this user is not actually allowed to browse our media browser service. Okay, also here we have to check here our item that when ready, so we can just call this. Okay, so if you navigate here to this on prepare media ID here, which is just from the audio media playback preparer, so you can just come here because we forgot to finish up here our media item, so you can just also use here media source. And basically here now we can just call, and here basically now we want to load the item when we already loaded this. If the item are already loaded, so you can just access the item inside here. And also we have to call prepare here media. And basically here now we can just pass in the media item, so you can just use this media source. Okay, so we have also prepared this prepare here, passing the media item, the item to play and play when ready. And also we have to use this when ready here in order to execute this because our media source is ready and it has already fetched the data. Okay, so now I think here we have just finished to implement here our media player service, and we have already sent the result here from the on-road children and on get root. So there are just several things which we want to finish up here, and they're just minor thing. And the first thing here, what we want to do is to override the on custom actions. So because we're just going to be sending these custom actions here. And basically here we can just pass in here a when statement, and we can just check this action. And because we are just going to send this customs action by ourselves, so we can just use our start media player action. And basically here now we can just call the media player notification manager, and we can actually show the notification, and here we can just pass in the exo player. And otherwise here we can just check if this is just going to be refreshing media, so we can just pass in here. And for that case here we can just call the media source.refresh. And otherwise else we don't have any other custom action, so we just pass in here unit. So basically here now we can just call the exo player to stop because our item has been just removed, so we can just stop. And basically here now we can just clear the media item, so we can just call exoplayer.clear media item. And also here we have to override the onDisTrem method, and inside here the onDisTrem method here we can just easily stop the service scope which we have created, so we can just call this service scope.cancel. And after that we can just call exoplayer.release, so that we can just release the resources because our media player service has just been destroyed. So guys, so far we have made a bit of progress because we have implemented our server-side play where we are just going to play our audio. So as you can see here, we have implemented this media controller here and the media player and make everything here. And as you can see here, our media session communicates directly here to our player, and here our player now communicates. This media session here can communicate to this because we have implemented this session callbacks and other things. Now one thing which we have not implemented here is just the connecting object that is going to help us to connect this to our UI. And to do this we have to implement a connector. Okay, now we can just come here to our exo player and we can create a new Kotlin class or file, and we can just call this media player service connection. Okay, and we want to inject this. And here we basically provide the context. Okay, now this is just a class that is going to be helping us to communicate, so we don't perform a lot of logic here. So basically here we want to create some states that can be easily observed inside our view model. So this class is going to be treated as a black box. So for that case here, now we can just create several states which we want. So for our case here, we are just going to create here a private val, and here for example we just want to obtain the playback state. And we can just use here the mutable state flow. And basically here we want to pass in here the playback state compact. And this one is just going to be a nullable type. So for our case here, now we can just pass in here to be a mutable state flow. And we can just pass in for the first time here to be null. And for that case here, now we can just provide a variable that is going to be observed by the view model. So we can just call this playback state. And this one can take up a state flow. And here basically we pass in here the playback state compact, and we call a get function here, and we provide here our playback state. Okay, so we are just going to create another state that is going to help us to know if our connection has been established between the media browser and our UI. And for this case here, we can just create a state. So here I'm using a live template, so you can just create a live template. I have a video where I'm talking about how you can create this live template here. So we are just going to call this is connected. Also, we want to get the current playing audio, which we're going to use it to our UI. So we can just call this current playing audio. And we can just use here a mutable state of audio. And for the first time here, we're just going to pass in null. Okay, now also we want to create a variable that is going to help us to create the controller. So we can just create here a letInit variable, and we can just call this media controller. Now here we have our media controller. Another thing which we want to get here is the media browser service callbacks, which are going to help us to create a connection so that we can understand if we have been connected or not. So we can just create here a private variable. And here we have to create a new inner class here, which is going to help us to get these callbacks. So we can just come here and create a private inner class. And we can just call this media browser connection callback. And here basically now we want to get the context. And this class here must inherit from the media browser compact. And we can just call this connection callbacks here. And basically here now we can just press Ctrl O. And we want to override these three methods here, the onConnected, onConnection suspended, and onConnection failed. Okay, so here we have received our connection. So we want to check here is connected, and we can reinitialize this value. So we can change this to be true because we have already been connected to our media browser. And if otherwise here our connection is suspended, so we can just check is connected here and we can set it back to false. And also here we can just pass in this is connected.value and we can pass it to be false. Now directly here we can just create here our media service connection callback and we can pass in here our context. Okay, right now here we can just create another variable which is going to give us the media browser. So we can just call this media private val media browser. And basically here now we can just create here our media browser compact. And here we can just pass in the context and we want to pass in here the component name. And for our case here we can just use this context and we can use the media player service. And here basically now we can just pass in here our media service connection callback and here we can just pass in null for a root hint. And for that case here we can just call this .apply and here we can just connect to our media browser. Okay, so now we have here our media browser. We want to initialize this media controller. So we can just come here when we have just been connected inside this media browser connection callback here. So below this is connected value here, we can just initialize here our media controller. Okay, here we can just pass in here our callback and also we want to pass in here the media browser and we can pass in here the session token and we can just call this apply and here we want to register the callbacks. And basically here now we are just going to create another callback that is going to help us to get the controller callbacks. Okay, now here we can just create another inner class that is going to help us to provide these callbacks. So we can just create here private inner class. And we can just call this media controller callback. And this one's just going to inherit from the media controller.callback here. And here basically we are just going to override three methods here, the on playback state changed, on metadata changed, and the on session destroyed. So if you want other methods, you can just override them. Okay, so here what we want to do here is to initialize our state. So here we want to set this playback state here and we can just set equal to the state which is provided by this on playback state here. So when any state has changed here, our playback state value, this one is also going to be changed. Okay, so here we want to get the current playing audio. So you can just call this current playing audio because here we are just going to get this on metadata changed. So when a user just changes, for example, clicks another item, this method here is going to be triggered. So we want to change our current playing audio here. So you can just call this current playing audio.value and we can just call our metadata. And sometimes this could be null. Also, we want to get the audio list so that we can easily just get the item which was clicked. So you can just create here a simple variable. So you can just call this. Okay, so we are just going to change this audio list later time. But for now here we can just come to our, okay, we are just going to use here our audio list, and we can use a Kotlin find function here, and we can just locate here, and we can just change this, for example, here to be data, and we can just check here the audio it.id, and we can change this to a string, for example. And here we want to check this by using this metadata here, which has been changed, and we can get the description.media ID. So we are just going to find this current playing audio item, because we are going to check these IDs here. Okay, and here we want to, when our session has been destroyed, we want to call the media browser service callback so that it can easily suspend. So we can just call this media browser service callback here, and we can call the on suspend. And this method here we have defined in a moment here. As you can see here, we want to set this value back to false. So we are just going to call this, and our connection has been suspended for this case here, because our media session or the media state has been destroyed. And here now we can just register our media callback. Okay, now here we can try to define some other variables which we are going to use them. So the first thing here which we want to get the root media ID, and we can just easily make this private here. And also here we want to get the root media ID, so you can just call this root media ID, which we are going to use it to our view model. And here we can provide a get function, and we can just call this media browser .root ID. And also here we want to be able to transport the controls, so we can just create here another variable, and we can just call this transport control. And here we can just use this .transport controls. And we can also provide here a get function, and we can just use here our media controller compact, and we can call transport controls, which is going to help us to provide the controls. Okay, so I think here we have finished to define several things. So the other thing which we want to do is to provide the functions which are going to help us to play, pause, and do other actions. Okay, so before here we write these functions, let's create here a simple extension class that is going to help us in deciding simple things here. So we can just call this playback state compact extension. Okay, so here we can just create an inline variable, and we can just call this playback state here, and we can check is playing. And this one is going to be of type boolean. Now we can provide here a get function. So we want to check the state if we are just here, for example, in buffering state. Otherwise, we can check also here if we are actually playing. And another thing which we want to get here is the current time or the current position which you are playing. So you can just call the playback state here, and we can call this current position. And this one is just going to give us a current position of our item. And basically here now we can just provide a get function here, and we can check here if this is state, for example, we are just playing. Okay, so here we want to get the delta time, and this is just the difference between the first time and the new updated time here. So we can just get here delta time. And basically here we can just use the system clock, and we can just get this elapsed real time here. And also we can just call the last update position here. So this is just the difference in time when we just updated here our position, and this is just going to come in handy in a moment. You're just going to see how we can use it. And for our case here now we want to return the position, so we can easily get the position by calling this position here. But however, we cannot just return this position, because a player could be going from, for example, playing with a speed from 1.2, 1.3 and more. So we want also to compensate that time also. That's why we have created this time delta here, so that we can compensate that playback speed. And here basically now we can just multiply by the playback speed. And otherwise here we can just call this too long. Okay, so here we have our correct position. Else here if we are not playing, so we can just return the position. Okay, so as you have seen here, we are just getting this time delta here in order to get the time differences, because a player could be playing in a speed, for example, 1.2 or 1.3 or more. So we want to compensate the time which has taken a user to increase the speed so that we can update the position correctly. So that's why we are just taking this time delta here and multiplying by the playback speed and also adding this to the position so that we can get the actual time. So for that case here, we have our position. And we can just come back here to our media player service connection here and create these functions. Okay, now here let's create a little room. So for case here we want to create a playing audio, so we can just create here a function and we can just call this play audio. And here basically we can just pass in the audios. And this one's just going to take up a list of audios. And here basically now we can just initialize our audio list. And we can set this equals to these audios here. And here now we can just use our media browser and we can send custom action. And here basically now we can just pass in our action and we can just call start media player action here so that we can just send it to play. And here basically we can just pass in null. And here also null. So we are just sending here our custom action. So for that case here, we can just easily play. And also here we want to pause our audio. We want to fast forward. So we can just create here a fast forward. So to fast forward here, we want to get the seconds. So for our case here, we can just provide here a default value of 10. And here now we can just use our playback state. And we can call this current position here. And also here we can just let this value here. So we want to call the transport control here in order to seek to. So we can just call this seek to. So for our case here, we can just provide the current position here. And what we want to get here is seconds. And in order to transform this, we can just multiply by 1000 so that we can just change it to. Okay, so here we have finished to change our item. So also we want to, for example, rewind. So we can just copy this and we can call this rewind. And instead here of adding, we can just put a minus sign here in order to delete these items. Okay, also here we want to provide a function that is going to help us to skip to the next item. And here basically we can just call our transport control.skip. Okay, also here we want to provide a subscription item. So we can just create here a function and we can just call this subscribe. And basically here we can just pass in the parent ID. And also we want to get the callback. And this one is, we want here to get the connection callback here. And what we can do, we can just call the media browser and we can call this subscribe. And here we can just pass in the parent ID and we can pass in here the callback. And also we want to provide a function that is going to help us to unsubscribe. So we can just call this unsubscribe here and we can just call here unsubscribe also, because we are just passing the same items here. And here also we can just provide a function that is going to help us to refresh our media. And here basically we can just pass in the media browser and we can send custom action. And basically here now we can just call the refresh. And here we pass in null. So I think until now we have finished to create everything here. So everything from here we have created, and what has remained here is just to create the UI part. So for our case here, in the next videos, we are just going to create the view model, and also we have to create our UI in Jetpack Compose. Okay, now let's navigate here to our UI. So inside here now we can just create a new package and we can just call this audio. And here basically now we can just create our audio view model. So you can come here and create our audio view model. Okay, so we want to pass in here several dependencies, so you can just create here, we can just inject this class and we can inject the constructor. And here what we want to pass in is the repository, so we can create a private val and call this repository, and we pass in here the audio repository. Also we want to pass in here the service connection, and we can easily pass that media service connection. And for that case here we want to inherit this from a VIEWMODEL class. And also here we can annotate this with @HILT VIEWMODEL. Okay, so let's create here some variables which we want to use them. So the first thing here, we are just going to create our audio list. And here basically we can pass in the audio list. So this one is going to be observed by the composables. So that's why we are just using this mutable state list of, so that we can pass in here to our composables. Okay, also we want to get the current playing audio. So we can just call this current playing audio. And here basically now we can just use our service connection and we can call here our current playing audio. And this is just a mutable state. So if you press here Ctrl Q, you can see that this is just a mutable state of audio. So it's going to return as an audio. Also, we want to create here another variable. We check here if this is going to be connected. So we can pass in here is connected. And also here we can use our service connection and we can call here is connected. And this one is going to help us to decide if our application is actually connected to the media browser service. Also, we want to provide here to get the root media ID. So we can call this root media ID. And this root media ID here, we want to obtain it after we are just connected. So otherwise here we are just going to get an exception because our media is not connected. So for that case, we are just going to initialize this at a later time. Okay, also we want to get the current playback position. Okay, also here let's create another variable which is going to help us here to update the current position. So we can just create here a private var. And for the first time here, we can just set this to true. So we are just going to see how we can use these variables here. Now let's create here the subscription callbacks so that we can easily subscribe to our media browser. So we can just create here a private variable. And here we can just use this object here and we can override this media browser. And here we can override this media browser compact and we can call this subscription callback. And here basically we can override this on child loaded here. So for example here, if you want to get the data, so this is just the thing which we sent here from our media browser. So if you come here, for example, to our media, we come here to our service. So if you navigate here to our onload children here, as you can see here, we sent this result here, this result mutable state of items here. So if you want to use this data here, you can just come to your audio view model. So you have this mutable list of children's here. So you can transform this to what you want to display, for example, or you can send it to the data. So for our case here, we are just going to fetch this data by using our repository. Okay, so for that case here, we can create another variable which is going to help us to get the connection between the media browser and media service. So the last class which we created from the last video. So if you have not seen them, you can find the video in the link in the description box. And also you can find the source code in the link in the description box. Okay, now here we can just provide this service connection here. So we are just going here to implement some logic here to help us to update the playback. So for now, we are just going to leave this empty. So we are just going to update this in a moment. So for now here, we can just create another init block here so that we can just initialize our view model. Okay, now here we can just call the view model scope here and launch. Okay, now here we want to initialize our audio list. So first here we have to create here a private function that is going to help us to get this data. So we can just call this private fun, and here we can just call get and format audio data. And this one is just going to return a list of audio. Okay, so here we want to use the repository here to get our data. So we can just call this repository and get audio data. And also here we want to transform this. Okay, so the first thing here, what we want to do is to get the display name, because here sometimes the display name is going to return until the file extension. So we want to transform this data here and format it for display. So we can just call this val display name. And here we can just get this, and we call substring before. And here basically now we can just provide a delimiter. So for our case here is just this dot here. Okay, also here we want to get the artist. So sometimes this is just going to return an unknown artist and it's just not formatted well. So we are just going to check. So if it, and here basically now we can just pass in, sometimes it's just going to bring you here with this unknown here. So if we get this, we want to return here unknown artist. And otherwise else here we can just return it dot artist. And here basically now we can just copy this data which we have here, and we can just change the display name. And basically here now we can just call artist. And also here we want to pass in the display name. So the display name here, we can just pass in our display name, and also we can pass in here the artist. And we can just format this artist name here. And this we can just create here to be a private suspend function. Okay, so here we can just get and format our audio data. So we can just come here and reinitialize this data here by calling this the audio data. So we can call get audio and format audio data. So here we have loaded our data. Okay, now inside here also we can check if our variable is just connected. So we can just call this is connected, and basically here now we can just collect our data. And here basically now we can check if this is just going to be true. So we can just initialize here several variables. So we can just call here our root media ID. And now here we can use our service connection.get root media ID. So we get our media ID. Also we want to initialize here our current playback position. So we can just get the state. So we can just call this service. Okay, so here we can just update the current playback position, and basically we can just use the position from this data here. So here we have our position where we're just going to be playing, and also we want to subscribe, and here basically now we can just call the service connection. And basically here now we can just pass in the root media ID, and this is just going to be our media ID which we have passed and obtained from our media browser root. And here we can pass in the subscription callback so that we can easily subscribe. So without subscribing here, our media browser is not going to play anything. Okay, so now I think here we have already connected our data. So we can just create now the function that is going to help us to change the player. So for our case here, we can just create a play audio. And here basically we can just pass in the current audio. Okay, so the first thing here, we want to transport the connection here. So we can just call this play audio. And basically now we can just pass in here the list, the audio list. So here is just going to help us to transport the controls and call those custom actions here, because we created this function here, because we're just going to send these custom actions here and call this start media player action here. And we want this to initialize this audio list here so that we can just use it to find the current playing media ID. So for that case here, we have sent those action. Now we want to check if the current audio which we are just playing here, the current audio.id. So if this is just going to be the same as the current playing audio, and here basically now we can find the value. So if this is just the case that we know we are just playing an audio that is already initialized, so what we want to do here is either pause or play the audio. Okay, so here also we want to get the playback state, so we can define here another variable. So for example, here we can just create another private val. And also here we can just call this playback state. And we can call this service connection.playback state here. And also here we want to check if the audio is playing. So this one's just going to return a boolean, and here we can just define a get function here. So we can use this playback state here, and basically here we can get the value, and this could be a nullable value, and we can just check this if it's playing here, and basically here we want to make this to be true so that it can be either playing or not. So we can just come back here and see if this, and here we want to check if the audio is actually playing here now. Okay, so if the audio is actually playing, so if this value returns true here, we know that we are playing the audio. So we want to pause the audio, so we can just call this service connection here, and we can call transport control and call pause here. So basically we are just going to pause. Otherwise else here we want to just play this because the audio was paused. So we can call this service connection and transport the control and call play here, and we can just easily play. So for that case here, if this is going to be equal to the value playing here, so we know that there is an audio already initialized and playing. So if this is not the case here, we can just write here another else block here. So we want to transport the control in order to prepare the media, so we can just call the service connection here and call this transport control and play from media ID. And here basically now we want to play from the media ID, and we can just use the current audio. And for that case here also we can just pass in, for extras we can pass in null here. Okay, so here we are just checking if this current audio is going to be playing. So we are knowing that there is an audio already initialized here, so we can just easily pause and play here whenever the value is. And otherwise else here we want to initialize another variable, and we can just pass in here the current audio.id here in order to make the audio to play. Okay, now here we can just create another function that is going to help us to stop the playback. So we can just create here fun and call this stop playback. And here basically now we can just transport our control. So we can call this service connection here and call transport control and call stop. So basically here we're just going to stop our playback. Also, if you want to fast forward, so you can just create here a function and we can just call this fast forward. And basically here we can just call our service connection here, and we can just call fast forward, which we have already implemented. So if you want to increase the variables or the value of time here, because we set the constant to be 10 seconds. And also here we can just create another function, and here we can just call this rewind. And here we can just call this service connection.rewind because we created this variable from the last video. Also, we want here to skip to the next item, so we can just create here a function. And we can just call this skip to next here. Okay, also we want to create another function that is going to help us to seek to another position. So when the user uses that, the seek bar, so that we can just move to other positions. So we can call this seek to. And before we use this, we can just come here above and we can create here to get a current duration. And here we can use our media player service. And basically here we can just call this current duration. So we define this from when we are just creating our service here. We define this companion object here and provided this current duration here, which is just going to be the current duration of the playing media ID. So for that case, we are just going to come here to our seek value too, and here we will have to pass in a value. So here we can call this value, and this one is going to be of type float because it's going to come from our data. So here we can just call the service connection here, and we can call transport control, and basically we can call seek to. And here basically we want to seek to a certain position. So what we want to do here, we want to get the current duration here, and basically here we can just multiply this by the actual value, and after that we want to divide this with 100f so that we could have we can have here a percentage values. So this values is going to be in terms of percentage. So for that case here we can call this to long. So if this is just going to be 50% here, then we know we are just going to seek until a 57% or other percentage here for our case. That's why we're just dividing this by 100. Okay, now let's create here another function that is going to help us to update the playback and also provide a progress for our progress bar. So here we can just create this to be a private function, and we can just call this update playback. Okay, so we can just call here our view model scope, and we can call launch here. And also we want to create a variable that is going to help us to give a playback state that is going to give us the audio durations or the audio progress. So we can just create here another variable, and we can just call this var. And here basically now we can just create a mutable state of, and we can just pass in here 0f to be our mutable state of 0f. Okay, first thing first, we want to get the position, so we can just call this position. And basically here we can use our playback state here, and we can call dot value. And we want to get the current position. And otherwise else here our current position we're just going to return 0 here if this is just going to be null. And for that case here we can just check if our current position, our current playback position here, if this is just not going to be equal to this position or the current position which we have, and this is just the variable we set it for the first time to be 0. So for this case, if this value is not initialized to this position here, so we can just change the current playback position here, and we can just set it to this position so that we cannot be reinitializing a variable that is just the same. And for that case, we can just check here also if our current duration, so this duration which we have here is just going to be greater than 0 here, then we want to create our current audio progress. And here basically now we want to calculate our audio progress, which can be easily displayed to the audio seek bar. Okay, so we want to initialize this variable to be able to be displayed in a seek bar or in a progress bar, which we're just going to provide here. So here we can just create we can just calculate here our current audio progress. So we can just call this current audio playback position here, and we can send this to float. And basically here now we want to divide this with a current duration, which we are going to have the current duration, and we can just also change this to float. And also we want to multiply this by 100%. So here we can just make this 100f here so that we can transform it to a percentage values. Now for that case here we want to, if we have finished to update here our current progress, what we want to do here, we want to delay this function here to execute. And here basically we can just delay this. We can use the playback interval which we have provided in our constants, and for that case here we can just call if our update position, if update position we are just allowed, and we set this value here to be true. And for that case here we can just call again this update playback updates playback here method. So we want to recall this variable every time after every this, for example here after every second here we want to update this. So because these values could be changing and so that we can just reflect it inside our progress bar. So for that case, we are just going to call this, and we are going to stop this value here to be updating when our view model is going to be cleared. So that is just the simple thing which we are going to update our progress. Okay, so we want to also finish up our media browser. So we want to unsubscribe when our view model is going to be disconnected or cleared. So we can just override here the onCleared method. And basically here now we can just call the service connection, and we can call unsubscribe here. And here we want to pass in the root media ID. So we can just call this k.media root ID. And here we want to pass in the subscription callback. So we can just pass in here the media. And we can call this subscription. And basically here we want to pass in the subscription callback, and we don't want to override any type of method here. And for that case here, I think we have finished to unsubscribe, and we want to call this update position here, and we can just set this to false. And for that case here, we cannot now update our variables. So when our view model is just cleared here, so this method here, which we have right here, is not going to execute because we have just stopped the position here to be updated, because here we are just been recalling here if this update position here, and for the first time we set this to true. So after that, then we are just going to set this back to false here, so that we cannot execute this method again and again, because we have actually cleared our view model. Okay, now we can just try to rebuild here to see if there is no any error we have here. So guys, our project has finished to build successfully, and we don't have any errors. Okay, now here we want to fetch the data inside our storage, and in order to do this, we have to get the permission first from Android, because this is just a dangerous permission. So in order to do this using Jetpack Compose here, we have to use the Google Accompanist library. So we can just come here inside our build.gradle file, and here we have several dependencies which we are just going to use. So we can just add another dependency here. So we can just paste this implementation here, Accompanist library, so that we can just use them. Okay, now let's sync here our project and get started. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our manifest file, and here also we are just going to declare the read external storage permission. So we can just put this, and here we are just using this Android permission.read external storage, and here I have passed in to be the max SDK vision to be 28. So for that case here, now we can just easily request our permissions. Okay, so now we want to request a permission whenever we enter or we open up our application, because our application solely depends on that permission. So if our user is not granted that permission, we have to request again and again. So in order to do this inside here our Jetpack Compose, the first thing we can just easily get the state or the permission state, because in Jetpack Compose everything is just inside the state. So we can just call this permission state. And basically here now we can just call remember permission state. So basically here now we want to pass in the permission which we want to request, and because we have already passed there, we have only one permission, so we can just call this manifest here, and you can use this manifest Android, and we can just call this we want permission and call the read external storage here. So if you could have multiple permission, could just pass in a list of permissions here. So for that case here, we have also to annotate this with @opt-in experimental API, because this is just an accompanist library. So for that case, they are always marked with this experimental permission API, for example here. Okay, now here we want to request our permission inside our, when we launch up our application, we are on the on resume state. So we want to request this permission, and in order to do this, we have to use the lifecycle observers in order to see when we are going to be inside this on resume state. And for this case here, we can easily do this inside Jetpack Compose. So let's create a little room first here. So we can just create here a variable, and here we want to call this lifecycle owner, and basically here we can just call the local lifecycle owner. And we can use this .current here in order to get our lifecycle owner. So we want to add observer here, and we cannot add an observer inside here our composable, because this composable here will be recomposed every time when the state changes, and this is just going to add multiple observers. And for this case here, we have to use effect handlers. So we can just pass inside here a key, and for case here we have a lifecycle owner, and we can make this effect inside the lambda function here. So what we want to do here, we have to call the onDispose method, because this disposable effect is going to have onDispose method. So this onDispose function here is going to be called when this key has changed here, or we have just moved out of this composition, so that we can just free up the resources. So for case here, we are just going to create the observer, which we want to get it. So we can just call here a variable observer. And here basically now we can just call the lifecycle event observer. Okay, so here we have two variables. So we are just going to want to get the event here. So we can check here if we are just going to be inside the onResume. So we can just check here if this event is going to be inside the onResume here, event.onResume, and then we can just easily request the permission. So if we are in the onResume state here, we can just call the permission state here, and we can call here launch permission request. So here it's just going to handle for requesting permissions using this library here. And for that case here, now we can just create our observer. So we can just call this lifecycle owner here, and we can call this lifecycle, and we can add here our observer. And for that case, we can just pass in this observer here. Now for that case, we have added here observer. Now let's remove this observer when we are just going to be disposed. So for that case, we can just also call this lifecycle owner.lifecycle, and we can just call this remove observer here, and we can just easily pass in the observer which we have created. So the good thing about this, we don't have to handle this composition, because Jetpack Compose is going to recompose a lot. So for that case, we could add a lot of observers here, and when we relieve the composition, we don't want to have these observers. So we are just going to call this onDispose effect if this key here has changed, or if this lifecycle of or this Jetpack, this composable screen has navigated to another screen. So we have moved out of this composition, and for that case, it's just going to remove this. So we can just easily handle here our request of permissions. Okay, now we want here to show the UI if and only if we have the permission to do so, because we cannot allow the user to play the application because we are just going to crash. So we can just check here. If we have the permission state, we can just call this permission.state and has permission. And for that case, we have been granted permission, so we can just show our UI. And else here, we are just going to show an error box that is going to tell the user that we do not have the permissions to show you the data. So we can just easily here create a box, and basically here now we can just pass in the content alignment, and we can just make this alignment center here. And basically here now we can just show a text, and we can just tell the user that grant permission first. So for that case here, we have told them that we do not have the permission to show you the UI. So just show us. So we can just handle here or show other things to the user. So for case, we're just passing this text here. Now here we can just call our VIEWMODEL here in order to get the data, because we have our permission. Okay, now let's create here a variable, and we can just call this audio VIEWMODEL. And here we can just create using this VIEWMODEL composable function, and here we can just pass in the model class. So for case here, we can just keep this inside another line. So we can just pass in here the model class. And basically we can just use this audio. We can use this audio VIEWMODEL here, and we can just pass in the reference of this class.java here. So we have our VIEWMODEL, and also we want to get our audio list, and we can just easily call this audio VIEWMODEL.audio list. And because this is just a snapshot state here, it's just going to be observed by the Jetpack Compose. So whenever we change this, we can just easily recompose again. Now we want to create our screen here, so we can just easily come inside here our UI and inside here our audio. So we can just create here our home screen. Okay, now let's create here a new composable, and this composable here, we're just going to call this home screen here. Okay, so here we want to create our bottom sheet scaffold, because we are just going to use that bottom sheet to display our player. So for that case, we can just call this bottom sheet scaffold here. And here basically we have to pass in the sheet content. And this class here requires us to pass in the opt-in, but I think if you are just using Composable version 1.1.0, this is just going to be in a stable release. So for that case here, we have our sheet content here. Also, we can just pass in here the scaffold state. So we can just call this scaffold state. And here basically we can just call remember scaffold state. We can just call this bottom sheet scaffold state here. Okay, and basically here now we can just pass in here our scaffold state. So we want to create here our sheet content in order to be displayed here. We want to create our player. So for that case, we can just, and here we just create a new composable here. Okay, now let's call this bottom bar player. And this bottom bar player here requires us to pass in here several dependencies. So for case here, we want to get the progress because we're just going to show here a progress bar. So we can just call this progress, and this is just going to be of type float. The first thing which we want here. Also, we want to check the on progress change. And this is just going to return unit here. Also, what we want to do here, we want to get the audio which we want here. We can just call this audio. And also here we want to check if this is audio playing, so that we can just change our state. So we can just call this is audio playing. And this one's just going to be of type boolean here. Also, we want to have the commands here, the on start. And we want also to combine here the on next. So we are just going to change this to be on next. Okay, now let's create here our bottom bar player now. Okay, so here is just our UI. So we have here the first content, which is just displayed inside a row. And this two content here just being displayed in a column format. So we are just going to have a column, a row here displaying these items here, and also another item inside the column. Okay, now here we want to create our column. And basically here now we have our first item. So we have to create a row here so that we can just display this inside a row. So we want to pass in here a modifier. And basically we want to pass in here a height. So we want to limit this to 56 dp here because we don't want this to be taller than our content. So we're just passing this to be 56 dp. Also, we want to pass in here the horizontal arrangement. And basically here now we can just arrange space between here because we want to arrange this in a space between. As you can see here inside our design. So we want this to have only a single space here, and also we can just make this to be pushed here to here. So that's why we're just using this space between here. And also we want this to be arranged in a vertically. So we can just call this vertical arrangement, and we want to align them alignment center vertically here. Okay, so inside here we have two things. So we have this information here about the artist and the playback, and also here we have the controller. So we can just create here a separate composable that is going to represent this thing here, and this is just going to be represented in another composable. So we can just come below here, and basically outside here we can just create a new composable, and we can just call this artist information. And here basically we want to pass in here a modifier. And also we want to get the audio so that we can just get the audio metadata. Okay, now let's create here a row that is going to hold up the artist information here. And what we want to pass in here, we want to pass in the modifier, and we want to provide a padding. And basically here we can just pass in a padding of 4 dp. And also we want to align this vertically. And we can make them to align center vertically. Okay, so as you can see here, we want to create this icon here. And as you can see, these icons here, we have several icons which we're just going to create. So we can just create a separate composable that we can easily reuse it to just to display different icons here. So we can just come below this and create another composable. And we can just easily call this player icon item. Okay, so here we can just pass in here several dependencies. So you want to pass in first the modifier, and we can just make this to be a default parameter and pass in here another modifier. And also we want to pass in here the icon which we are just going to be using. So we can just make this the image vector. And also we want to show if we are just going to use a border. So we can just call this border. And here basically we just use our border stroke, and this must be nullable. And for default, we can make this to be null. And another case here, we want to get the background color. Okay, and here we can just use our material theme. And we can just use this on surface here to get the first default color. And also here we are just going to pass in the content color. So basically here now we can just use the material theme on surface color. So basically here we have to pass in the surface, not on surface. Okay, and also we want to have whether we can just implement this on click, because in some variables here we want to be able to click our button. Okay, now let's create here a surface that is just going to help us to define the attributes for which we want here. And here basically now we want to pass in the shape, and we want this to be a circular shape. Okay, also here we want to pass in the border, and we can just easily pass in the border which we have created here. And also we want to pass in here a modifier, and we can just make this modifier. And we can just invoke this on click here. And here the content color, we can just easily pass in here to be this color. And also we want to pass in the color, which is just going to be the background color. And for our case, we can just call this background color here, so that we can just easily pass inside here our color. Okay, now here we want to create another, and also here we want to clip this to be, and we can call this to be clip. And here we can just pass in here our circular shape. So we want when we click this to not create a rectangle, instead to create a circular shape when we show the repos. So we are just using this clip in order to clip those to be inside a circular shape. Okay, now let's create here our button. Okay, now let's create here a box that is just going to help us to provide this data, and we can just pass in here the modifier. Okay, so we have here our padding of 4 dp. And here we want to provide the content alignment, and we want to align this center. And here basically we can just create an icon composable here, and we have to pass inside here our icon, and basically here we can just pass in to be null. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create an player icon item here, which we can just easily reuse and substitute with data which we want. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our artist information, and here basically now we can just create our player icon. So we can just call this player icon, and here basically we have to pass inside here our icon. So we can just call this icons, and we want to use the music note here to be our icon here. And also here we want to pass in a border. So we can just easily create here a border stroke. So we want this to have a width of 1 dp. And we can just pass inside here the color, and we want to use the material theme. And we can pass in here the color to be on surface. And for that case, we have our data. And we are not going to react for clicks inside this item here, because we are just not going to have this data. Okay, and inside here now we can just easily pass in a spacer, and we want to pass inside here a modifier, and we can easily pass in here a space of 4dp. Okay, so we want to create this text here, and as you can see, these two text here are just inside a column, so we can just easily create a column and pass in these two text field here. And for that case, let's just create here a new column. Can create a little bit of space here, and here basically now we can just pass in our first text here. And what we want to do, we can just use this audio. So we want to modify this. We want to pass inside here the font weight, and we can just make this to be bold. Okay, also here we can just change the style here. So we can just use this material theme, typography, and we can just call this to be header 6, so that we can just make it to be bigger than the other text. Also, we want to see if the text could be bigger than the space available, so we want to just clip here. So we can just call this text overflow, and we want to clip. So basically it's just going to delete the data here if it's just going to be more than the items there. Also, we want to pass in here the modifier, so we want to make the weight here. And we can basically make this to be 1F here. So we have here our first text, and also we can just create here a spacer. And here basically we can just pass in a space of 4dp. Also, we can just create another text here, so to display here our subtitle, the artist information here. So for our case here, we can just call this audio.artist. And here basically we can just pass this to be a normal font weight. Okay, so we want this to be, we can change the style of this, and we can just easily use here material theme dot typography, and we can just use this subtitle 1 here to be a smallest subtitle here. Also, we want to pass in here the overflow, so if the artist name is going to be bigger, so we can just use this to be clipped. And we also want to make this max line here. Okay, also, and here we can just make this to be only a single line, so we can just make this max line, so that we don't want this to be wrapped inside the second line if the text is large. That's why we have provided this text overflow clip here, so that when we are just going to have more than one line here, we just clip the other text here. Okay, now let's just collapse this data here. And I think we have finished to create our artist information. So we can just come back here inside our bottom bar player here. So we can just pass inside here our artist information. And basically here now we can just pass in here our audio. And one thing which we want to do here is to pass in here a modifier. And basically here we want to provide a weight here. We want to provide this to be 1F, because here we are just going to have a lot of information and we don't want to push the other items here. So as you can see here, we want only this to occupy a certain place and not push all of this data away off the screen. Okay, now let's create here our media player controller, because we want to control this by play and pausing. So we can just create this inside another composable. So we don't want to clog all of the data inside a single composable. So for this case here, we can just create a new composable and we can just call this media player. Okay, and inside here we want to get several dependencies. So we want to get this is audio playing, so that we can just easily change the data. And we want also to get the on start command here and the on next, so that we can just navigate to a next item here. Okay, so here we can just use our player icon here. And basically here we want to pass in the icon. So here we want to check this. So we can just make this inside the next line here. And we can use here the if statement. So if it's audio playing here, what we want to do is to pass in the icons. And else here we want to pass in the default play arrow here, so that we can just play. Okay, so as you can see here, we are just checking if this audio is playing, we are just using this pause icon, and otherwise else we are just using this play icon. So you could try to animate this, but we can just leave it at ease because it's just a subtle changes here. And also here we want to change the background color of this, so we can just make the background color and we can just use the material theme. And we want to use the primary color, because as you can see here, this is just inside an orange color here, so this is just our primary color. Okay, so for that case here, we want to invoke the onStart here, so we can just call this onStart, and we can easily invoke here onStart. Okay, also here we have another item, so we want to wrap this inside a row, so we can just place here Ctrl-Alt-J, and we can just surround this inside a row here. Okay, so here we want to pass in the vertical arrangement so that we can just arrange them vertically. So we can just pass in here the vertical arrangement and we can make this to be center vertically. And also we want to pass in here the modifier. And we're just going to make this height to be 56 dp here. And also we want to add a little bit of padding, and we can just add here a padding of 4 dp. Okay, so here we have the player icon and we want to add another item here. So we can just create a little bit of space here between these two items here, and we can just make this to be 8 dp. Okay, so we can just create a normal icon here. And basically here now we want to skip the next, so we can just call this icons. And we have this skip next here. And here basically we can just pass in to be null. Okay, so we want to pass in here also the modifier. So we can just call this modifier, and we can just make this item to be clickable. And basically here we can just call this on next item, and we can just invoke this so that we can just navigate to a next item. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our media player controller. So we can just come below this and create here our media controller. Okay, so we can just put this in a different line here. And also here we want to check is audio playing. So we can just pass inside here is audio playing. And we can easily invoke here our onStart. So we can just call this onStart. And we can easily call here our invoke button. And also we can just make this to be inside the same line so that we can understand what it is when we just easily read our code. So we can just call this on next here, and we can call this on next dot. So I think here we have our information. So we have our artist information here and our media player controller. Okay, so also what we want to do here is to create this slider here so that we can just easily slide and move these items here. Okay. And this is just represented by using that slider inside Jetpack Compose. And this just take in two values here. So we can just pass inside here our progress. Okay, so we want to also set the value range. So here we can just call this value range, and here basically we can just set the values which we want. So for our case here, we want this to start from 0f until, so we can just add 2 dots here until to be 100f. So for our case, we have been calculating this inside our view model to make it a percentage wise. So we are just going to start from 0 to 100% here. So that's why we are just overriding this on value change here, and then this on value range here, and then this is just going to be reflected inside our UI by passing these collective values here. Okay, now I think here we have finished to create our bottom bar player. Okay, now we want to preview our data here. So before we do this, we can just create here a dummy data that is going to help us to aid for this data. So I have already created this dummy audio list here. As you can see here, I have created a list of these audios here. So you can just easily copy this, or you can just create your own here. Okay, so let's call this bottom bar preview. And we want to show here the background, so we can just call this show background. And we can just set this to be true here. And what we have to do here, we can just call here our audio player theme here, and we can just call our bottom bar. So here we want to make this 50F, and here is just, we are just going to release this, and we can just use this dummy data here, and we can use the first audio item, and is playing here. We can set this to be true, and I think we are just good to go here. Now let's come here inside our split view and see our data. Okay, so here is our preview, and as you can see here, we have our data inside this. Now let's fix this to be inside a column here. I think we have made it to be inside a row, so we can just easily. Okay, so here is just our slide inside this bottom bar player here, and as you can see here, we have just added inside a row here, so we have to remove this. Now let's try also to re-preview again and see. Okay, so I think now they are just spaced correctly here. However, as you can see here, we are just not taking this to this last position here, and we can just easily fix this by passing inside here this modifier here. Let's rebuild again. Okay, so I think this is just our item here, and as you can see, it's just correctly displayed. Okay, now let's just come back here and finish up to create our other items. Okay, now let's call this bottom bar player inside here our sheet content. And before we do this, we want here to set this to show this bottom bar player if our audio is not null. And for this case here, we can just create this and pass in this data which we want to use them inside our home screen here. Okay, so here we can just pass in a progress, which we are just going to use it, and also the on progress change here. And this we want to make it to be a nullable, because this current playing audio could be null for the first time when we launch our application. And we want to get here the on start here, on item clicked. And also here inside our on start also we want to pass in the audio. So we want to pass this audio back so that we can just play that audio. And here we want to display our on next, and here we are just going to make it this to return unit here. We return nothing and return a unit here. Okay, so I think here now we can just easily create our composable. Okay, now let's check here our current playing audio, and this, if this is not going to be null, and we can just easily rename that to current playing audio. Okay, now here we can just call here our bottom bar player, and here basically now we can just pass in our progress. And here basically now we can just pass in the current playing audio. And here we want to invoke this to be on next, so we can just make it to be inside the same. So here we can just pass in this to be on next. Okay, also here we want to set the sheet pick height, so we can just call here the sheet pick height. And here basically now we can just animate this by changing it. So if this is just going to be, the audio is just going to be null, so we want to set the value to be 0. So we can just call this animated height. Okay, so here we can just use this delegate method by, and we can just animate dp as a state here. And here basically we can just easily change this. And we want to check if the current playing audio. So if this is just going to be null, so we can just pass in here 0 dp. And we can call this sheet pick height here. And for that case here, we can just pass in here our animated. Okay, now let's create a preview function that is going to help us to preview this home screen. And we can just come below this bottom bar player item here. And here we want to show the system UI. So for the case of progress here, we can just pass in 50F, and here we just pass in a null. And here is audio playing. We can just make this to be true. And here we can just pass in the dummy audio list, which we are just going to use. And we can just get the first item here inside our dummy audio list. And here the on start, we can just pass in an empty lambda function here. Okay, now let's re-preview again here our data. Okay, so here is just our bottom bar. So we can just come here to our design tab. And as you can see here, we have here our bottom player. So using this Android Studio Bumblebee, we can just easily interact with this composable. And as you can see here, now we can just easily slide this up here. And because we have not passed anything else here, we cannot interact with this. So now let's finish up our UI here. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our home screen. Okay, now let's create here a lazy column. And here basically we can make this content inside a lambda function. And here now we want to pass in the content padding. And basically here now we can just pass in the padding value here, and we want this to be the bottom sheet. So we want to pass in here inside the bottom, and then we can just pass in this to be 56 dp. Okay, so we are just passing this padding value here. As you can see here, this is just going to be a height of 56 dp when we finish up this. So we don't want this item to be hidden inside this bottom bar player here. So we want this to be giving this padding here. That's why we are just passing this bottom padding here to be 56 dp. Okay, so here we can create the items. And we can just pass in this items list here. And we can just easily pass our audio list. Okay, so we can just create here another composable that is going to hold up the audio item. So we can just create here a new composable. Okay, so now here we want to pass in the audio. So we want to pass in here the audio, which we are going to use it. And also we want to pass in the on item click. And this is just going to be of type long here. Okay, so as you can see here, we are just going to create this item here. And we have here a simple card that is going to hold up these two data. And this data here, we have the duration here. And also we have the item here to be displayed about the music. Okay, now let's just come below here. Okay, now let's create here our card. Also, we want to pass in here the padding of 8 dp so that we can just send this data away here. Okay, and also we want to make this to be clickable. And here we can just call the on item click, and we can just invoke this function here. And we can just use our audio, and we can just pass in here the ID, which is just going to be the ID of the audio. Okay, and here we want to get the background color, and here we can just use the material theme. So we want to, as you can see here, this color here is just going to be different from this. So we can just easily use the material theme, and we can modify the item. So we can just call this material theme. And here basically now we can just use the surface color. And what we want to do here, we want to copy this, and we can just change the opacity here, which is just going to be the alpha here, and we can just pass in here 0.5f. Okay, so we want to create this data here, and this data just inside a row. As you can see here, they're just horizontally arranged, and also these two here are just inside a column here. Okay, now let's create here our row. And here we can just pass in the vertical arrangement. And we can just center this vertically here. Okay, so we want to display these two items here. So we can just make them inside a column. So we can just call this column here. And here we can just pass in here a modifier. Okay, so we want to provide here a weight so that it can just push this data. So we want this to be 1F here. And we can just pass in here the padding of 8dp for our case here. Okay, so for this case here, we want to display our text, and here we can just create a little bit of a spacer first, and here we can just pass in here this to be 4dp. Okay, and also we want to first create our first text, which is just going to be the display of the item display name, and here we can just use our audio, and we can just call this display name here. And here we want to change the style, and we can just use the material theme. And here we want to use this to be header 6 here to change the style. Also, we want to use this overflow, and here we can just easily clip. And we can just pass in here the max line to be 1. Okay, now let's create here another text. And here we want to use now the audio artist. So we can just use this audio.artist. And we want to make this color here to be a little bit, as you can see here, this is just, it's going to be a little bit darker than this one here. And we can pass in this on surface, and we want to copy this color here, and we can just pass in this alpha, and we can pass this to be 0.5f. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our first text, which is just going to be this text here. Also, we want to create another text, which is just going to be at the left side here. And here basically we want to format our time, because our time we're just getting it to be a duration. So we want to format this to be in a certain style that a user can understand this, because here we're just getting an integer or a long value. So we cannot just display here this value. So we want to format this. So we can just create here a helper function that is going to help us to do this. And we can create here another private function. So this is just a normal function, not a composable function. And we can just call this timestamp. So you can just use any method here. So for our case, we're just going to calculate this to get the total seconds. So we can just call this total seconds. And we can use here a Kotlin flow function that is going to help us to convert this position here. So we want to take this position here, and we are just going to divide this by 1. So we are just going to divide this by 1 exponential of 3. So this is just 1000 here. So that this is just going to be, it's just going to round this value here, which we are going to get to a nearest integer here, so that we can just use it. And for that case, we can just call this to int. Okay, so we can just get the minutes which we are going to have here. And we can just use this total seconds, and we can divide this by 60. And we can calculate the remaining minutes. And here basically we can just get this total seconds. Okay, so here we want to return now our data. So we can just check here if this position is just going to be less than 0. So we can just call this position here. Okay, so we are just going to return if this position is just going to be 0, we don't know the time, so we cannot format this. So we're just going to return this. So we are just going to pass in here a template that is going to help us to format this. So we can just pass in this to be D. So we can just call this to format. And here basically we can just call this minutes here, and we can just pass in here the remaining minutes. Okay, so you can just use this even if to display, for example, a progress when this is just going to be playing. So for our case, we are just going to use this for one-time event. And for that case here, we can just pass in here our timestamp. duration, and we can just easily use the audio. Okay, and inside here now we can just pass in here a spacer, and here we want to get a spacer of 8 dp. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our audio item, so we can just navigate here and we can just call here our audio item, and here we can pass in here our audio. Okay, now let's preview here our item and see. Okay, now as you can see here, we have finished to create here our UI and we have everything here. So even if we start here our interactive mode, and we could easily set this state here in order to change these items here. So I think they are just clickable. We have here our time and we can just easily interact with this. So now let's create and finish up to hook up everything here inside our code. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our main activity. And here now we can just pass in the progress. So we are just going to use this audio view model, and we created this state from the previous video. So we can just get here the current audio progress. And we can just call here our audio view model, and we want to seek to a certain position. So we can just call this seek to here, and we want to pass in here the value, and we can just pass in this to be it. So when this value is going to change here, it's just going to reflect this current audio progress here and update our progress. And also here we can just check the audio is playing here. So we can just use our audio view model, and we can check is audio playing here, so that we can just change here our state if audio is playing or not. And here basically we can just pass in our audio list, and we have this current playing audio here, and we can call this dot value. Okay, so here we are just going to call this audio view model, and we can just call this play audio here. And here we want to pass in the current playing audio, and we can just pass in this to be it here. Okay, so inside here now we can just call this audio view model, and we want to play also the audio here. So we can just call this audio view model, and we can call play audio here, and we want to pass in here it. And for case here, this is just going to be the controller that is going to control here. So we have this controller here that is going to invoke this on start here. And also when we click this variable here, we want to play our audio. That's why we are just using this on item click here in order to invoke this audio to play here. Okay, so here we can just put in our on next, I think. Yeah. So we have here our on next item. So we can just use here our audio view model, and we can just call this skip to next, so that we can just skip to the next item. Okay, so I think here we have finished to create our view model and our UI. Okay, so this is just the moment of truth. Now let's try to run our application and see if we have any errors. Okay, so we are just getting here an error, and we can see here HILT activity must be attached to an HILT Android application. So, and then it's just giving us here, we have forgotten to add this inside our application class name. So we can just come inside here, our Android manifest file. And here now we can just provide a name. And as you can see here, we forgot to add this application class here. Now let's try to rerun again and see. Okay, now our app has launched successfully. Now we can just click allow here to allow that data. And here now we can just easily play this data here. Now let's try to click here, and we're just having here an error. We can just check here our log cut. And we can see that on custom action, we have problems here. So let's just navigate here inside our own service, and we can just come to this media player service here. And we can just navigate to this on custom actions here. And as you can see here, we forgot to add the super method. So we can just add this super method here, and we can just call these actions. And actually, let's try to rebuild again and see. Okay, now our app is launched again. And as you can see here, we have our application. But as you can see here, we have some problems here. We can try to fix them right now here. Our progress bar is not moving. And also this data here is just going to push these buttons here. And we can just easily fix this right now. Now let's jump inside here our code and we can try to fix this. Okay, so right now here we can just navigate inside here our audio view model. And as you can see here, I have added several fix me here because we have problems which we forgot to implement here. So if you come here down below, we implemented this update playback here. So this one is just going to help us to update the slider there, but we forgot to implement this method here. So that's why we're just coming inside here, our fix me number 1 here. And basically here now we can just call that get. We can call this update playback here so that it can be updated here inside when we finish to connect this by using this service connection here. Another thing here which we have another problem here is just this current duration here. We're just initializing to a single value, and this for the first time this is just going to be 0. So when you navigate here, you can see that we implemented this to be a 0. So when we initialize like this, we are just going to get a 0 current duration here. So in order to fix this, we can just make this to return a long. And instead here we can just provide a get function here in order to get this value. So whenever we want this value, it's just going to throw here a get function and get the data here so that we can just reflect here to get the current duration. So for that case, I think we have finished. So another problems which we had is just inside here our home screen. So we can just navigate here because those buttons, when the title was big, it's just going to push those buttons there. So we can just navigate inside this bottom bar player. And now we can check here inside our artist information because this is just the thing which has a problem that is just going to push the data. And we can just navigate inside this audio here. And as you can see here, we have not used this modifier, and here we created a new modifier. So these are just human errors. So we can just pass in here a modifier so that it can use this modifier. And here we are just passing here a weight in order to limit this. And we are doing this because this modifier here is just scoped inside here a row. So if we try to pass in a weight without passing this modifier inside here, we're just going to get the error because we are not having access to get that weight. Okay, so I think here let's try to rerun again and see if this has fixed our problems. Okay, now let's test again our application if we don't have any errors. So we can just navigate here and try to get this item. And as you can see here now, our progress is moving and we can easily control here our progress. We can navigate to the next item here, and also we can just easily pause. And even if we have something with a big title here, as you can see, this is just going to be scoped to another problems here. And we don't navigate to the first item here because we restricted this to just stop if we reach the last item inside our playing items here. Okay, also if we navigate off, and our application is just going to control, and here we can easily even control our application. And finally, our app has launched successfully. That was epic. Congratulations for finishing this series. If you have found value out of these videos, please provide a like and don't forget to subscribe so we can just code together. So let's leave it here, guys. See you in the next video. Bye bye for now.